Welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Frank Frazetta. He earned the title of Godfather of Fantasy Art thanks to his decades of creating gorgeous, action-filled, and sexy paintings. But before that, he was a Golden Age illustrator that worked in comics for decades. And that's what I want to talk about today, was his amazing career path in comics and how a single illustration for Mad Magazine in the 1960s changed his career path to becoming an in-demand painter for Hollywood and book publishers. I think that there's a lot we can learn from his masterful techniques as well as just having a good time following the twists and turns of his career path. So, without any further ado, hit the like and subscribe button, and let's begin. Frank Frazetta was born to Sicilian parents in Brooklyn in early 1928 and showed such artistic promise that his parents entered him into the Brooklyn Academy of Fine Arts at the tender age of 8. Studying under renowned Italian artist Michael Falanga, in interviews, Frazetta has said that he liked his time there, but he felt he learned just as much from observing his fellow students as from his teachers. He's listed comics artists like Jack Kirby as someone that he was a fan of at a young age, enjoying comic books and comic strips. Frazetta spoke of his young ambitions to the Comics Journal in 1995, saying, quote, "For some reason, I always had this urge to be doing comic books, and then from there, newspaper strips. I could always see that far ahead, and I thought about being a fine artist. Not that I saw any real future in it, maybe I'd just paint for the hell of it. Just hang them up on a wall. I didn't think anybody would pay me for them. There were no paperbacks around for me to even consider that field, but comics seemed to be the way to go. You knew about Capp and Milton Caniff and all the other guys. They were making all kinds of money, and they were household names, and that's what I looked forward to." So perhaps it's no surprise that Frazetta broke into comics at age 15, doing odd jobs at Bernard Bailey's studio, like erasing pencil marks after an artist inked a page, or simple tasks like ruling panel borders. Established artist John Giunta collaborated with Frazetta at age 16, inking Frank's pencils of a character he'd created as a kid, Snowman, published in Tally-Ho Comics issue 1. Within 2 years, Frazetta was illustrating stories on his own for Standard Comics, with his first confirmed story being a 4-pager about William Penn founding a settlement in America, and that came out in Treasure Comics number 7. It's somewhat rudimentary by Frazetta's later standards, but the figure work is more than competent, if not overly rendered. The subjects are always the focus of each panel, which makes reading the comic easy and not confusing. There are flashes of brilliance, like this well-detailed angry face. And in the same issue, Frazetta showed some of his versatility as an artist by drawing a humor page with his character, Captain Kidd Jr. That versatility would serve him well, and he drew a lot of funny animal stories for Standard at the time. In 1950, Frank Frazetta teamed up with artist Al Williamson for the first time on a Western story in Western Fighters issue 11. Already, you can see that Frazetta is taking more time to give his characters depth with some subtle hatching. The people look distinct and tangible. Frazetta and Williamson would go on to illustrate a bunch of fantastic westerns for places like Toby Press, and are well remembered by comics fans for their sci-fi stories at EC Comics between 1952 and 1953. The artists would trade the pages back and forth for pencils and inks, and the detail Frazetta's work included flowed from him like a burst dam. One beautiful story at this point that I'd recommend is Squeeze Play from Crime Suspense Stories issue 13. Originally offered to Williamson, he didn't want to draw the story because of the roller coaster in the story. Frazetta took it, but ended up needing help inking it to hit the deadline, so Williamson ended up helping draw that roller coaster after all. It's a great story of a murderer who threw his girlfriend from the coaster, only to hide on the beach and get dragged into the water by some pretty girls, where he drowns because he can't swim. It's also an early example of the gorgeous ladies Frazetta became known for. Now, if you're a fan of Frank Frazetta, you probably like fantasy, you probably like pretty girls, you may want to consider checking out the comics of this episode's sponsor, Pocket Jacks Comics. Writer Preston Poulter has a new 5-issue series, Palace of the Golden Princess. And this is a fascinating story behind the scenes. It is based on the first D&D campaign that was written by a woman, Jean Wells. And that story was immediately pulled by the publisher, who feared it was too sexy. But now, this book has been reimagined as an adventure starring Thora as she embarks on a quest for the evil Queen Erica. There's also a 5th edition optional game that you can order with this campaign. So, you can get this comic one of 2 ways. You can ask your comic shop to order you a copy, and the order code I'm both showing you and I have in the description below. Or there is a Kickstarter for this book, and that allows late pledges all the way through February, so that's another option. And again, I've got the link for that in the description below. I gotta say, I've read it, and I enjoyed, as somebody that plays D&D, the authenticity of the setting and the creatures and environments that they come across. I also found Thora to be a likable protagonist, which is important, and she's also conflicted right from the beginning. So it sets up some good drama right away. Very good art. I especially happen to like this variant cover by Scott Harbin, the painted cover, with this gold foil lettering. I don't know how well that shows up on camera, but Lizard Brain sees shiny, it wants shiny. I recommend it. Thank you to Preston and Pocket Jacks Comics for sponsoring this episode. Links in the description below, and let's get back to talking about the sexy work of Frank Frazetta. At EC Comics, Williamson and Frazetta sometimes worked with one of Frank's early mentors, Roy G. Krenkel, who lent inks to their stories. It's some of the best work EC Comics published, and it's been collected into many different editions. The Williamson-Frazetta duo also drew about 90 pages of Western stories for Toby Press, and that was run by Elliot Kaplan, the brother of the famous comic strip artist Al Capp. While their sci-fi stories at EC are just some of the best in comics history, period, I'd also call one of their westerns, a crime story for EC called Fired, one of the most gorgeously rendered comics ever. The lighting, the gesture, the acting they give to their characters. It's a really special story found within Crime Suspense Stories issue 17. Studying Frazetta and Williamson together could sincerely be an art class unto itself. But there is one thing I think I notice when I look at something like Al Williamson's art by himself compared to them teaming up, Frazetta and Williamson. And I could be wrong, but I think that as detailed as Williamson's artwork is, it has slightly harsher angles to it, versus when they work together, I think that Frazetta may be softening some of those hard edges, the corners, and rounding it and making it a little bit more lush. Just my opinion, but I think that that's a difference that I see. Frank Frazetta was very busy in the early through mid-1950s, working for publishers like EC and also magazine enterprises, among others, on books like Ghost Rider and Thunda, which was a Tarzan knockoff. But this is also an example, with the first issue of Thunda, of the only comic where Frazetta drew the entire comic himself. In 1952, Frank got his supposed dream job of drawing a comic strip, and that's where the best money was for illustrators at the time. Frank was drawing a new strip called Johnny Comet. He was only 24 years old, and it's some gorgeous work. But it slowly changed in the first year from an adventure strip to a humor strip, and it just didn't click with audiences. However, these strips, and Frazetta's work on a knockoff Li'l Abner comic for Al Capp's brother, as well as his various humor strips, all put him on Al Capp's radar. And Frazetta was offered a job as a ghost artist in Al Capp's studio on Li'l Abner. It's hard to overstate how popular and influential the Li'l Abner comic strip was. It started as jokes about hillbillies, but it grew to encompass all sorts of satire, and it was published in hundreds of newspapers across the world. Frazetta was ultimately given the job of drawing the pencils over Al Capp's layouts for the Sunday strip, and was offered $150 a week. So, if I use the inflation calculator here, that tells me that Frazetta was earning about $1,700 a week. So perhaps that explains why he went on to do that job for the next 8 years. Frazetta initially was given some regular strips, and he was allowed to use a more realistic style that Capp wanted to test. But the newspapers requested things go back to the original style, and Frank says he was perfectly happy to work on just the Sunday page. In his interview with the Comics Journal, Frazetta told Gary Groth he stayed there out of laziness, explaining, quote, "First of all, at the time I had just done the Johnny Comet strip. That became a chore. It was horribly written, and it got dumber as it went along, and I realized it was failing about halfway through. So all I dreamed about was maybe one day doing my own strip and making lots of money." And Frazetta continued to elaborate by saying, quote, "All I could think of was that I loved to tell stories and do comics, and Al Capp came up with an offer I couldn't refuse. It was a steady income. It only took one day to do that Sunday page, and that gave me the rest of my week off. So for 9 years, all I did was put in about 8 hours. That's all it took. And it wasn't even inked, it was just penciled. Now I had an income that I could get nowhere else, not for that kind of time, and that gave me free time to have fun. And I loved having fun. I loved goofing off, playing ball, and so forth. And besides, I didn't know what else there was." And that does sound like a dream job. The only thing it really didn't give Frank was a lot of publicity, of course, and it also didn't necessarily challenge his skills. So, after about 8 years of doing that, Frank Frazetta asked for a raise. He hadn't gotten a raise in that whole time. He asked for a raise, and Al Capp, notoriously difficult person to work with, responded by cutting Frazetta's salary in half. Now, Frank Frazetta was a proud guy. He wasn't going to stand for that, and he quit on the spot. All well and good, but now we're in 1961. Frazetta hasn't been super active in the comic book world, and now it was time to find his next job. It was a tough time for Frazetta to get work after not working regularly in comic books for so many years. Publishers like DC expressed that they thought his work looked old-fashioned, which blows my mind. 1962's output was primarily inking some stories at Dell and illustrating for second-rate men's magazines like Dude. In 1963, Frazetta began to move into getting freelance work for his painted pieces. Roy G. Krenkel helped him get some work painting covers for paperbacks. Frazetta did nearly 24 covers for a book publisher named Ace for characters like Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. By 1966, Frazetta was doing painted covers for Lancer, most famously his covers for Conan the Barbarian. And Frazetta far preferred working for Lancer. He told the Comics Journal about the book covers, saying, quote, "Look, at Ace, they paid me $200 for those covers. $200, and they kept the art. I didn't mind the $200, but they kept the art. In due time, they were suddenly selling it for $600 or $800, $1,000. So when Lancer called and said, 'The art is yours,' they even paid more, and the art is mine? Wow. Then I figured, okay, I'll put my heart out for this stuff." And I think you can tell that a lot more effort was put into the Conan work for Lancer compared to Tarzan at Ace. The Ace work was watercolors, a little simpler, and Conan is an early example of Frazetta working with oils. It was also very important to Frank Frazetta that he kept the artwork. That was something his wife, Ellie, pushed him to always ask for because she saw the secondary market value. During Frazetta's years working for Al Capp, he also did some covers for famous funnies on their Buck Rogers series. They are some of the most gorgeous covers in comics, and that's in large part because they let him keep the original art, which meant he gave it his best effort. Famously, they declined his final cover. They were going out of business. And so Frazetta offered it to EC Comics. Publisher William Gaines loved it and wanted it, but famously always kept the original art for what EC bought. Frazetta said that Gaines could use it for publication, but he wanted to keep the originals, and it's the only time Gaines agreed to not take the originals. He agreed to that. The art was slightly reworked from Buck Rogers to just a generic guy for the cover of Weird Science Fantasy number 29. I think it is an iconic comic book cover. I think if you look at the best covers in comic book history, it's one that you've probably seen reprinted a bunch. It definitely influences artists to this day. I've seen Tony Moore homage it in Fear Agent, for instance. And the cover by Frazetta is masterful. We're going to talk about some of his techniques later, but really, it's the composition here. Everything circles the subject and draws that action right into frame. It just draws your eye right to where it's supposed to go. Beautiful, beautiful cover. By 1964, the only comics work Frazetta was doing was painted covers for Warren Publications. He said he took that work because while it didn't pay that much, they let him keep his original art and let him paint whatever he wanted. I think books like Eerie and Creepy were certainly lucky to have such eye-catching artwork. One piece of art that Frank Frazetta did for Warren at this point really cracks me up. That's this anti-smoking campaign ad. And then here in this photo where you can see Frank delivering it to Jim Warren, you can see that Frank has a lit cigarette in his hand. He's clearly just taking a well-paying gig, even though he didn't care about the message. It just cracks me up. Frazetta famously painted the cover for the first issue of Vampirella and is credited as a co-creator for his work on her costume. I've always felt like for a Frazetta piece, it's a slightly weird pose. But then, just this past December, a user on the Facebook page Comic Swipes called Russell Fox Art pointed out a photo of actress Caroline Munro that may have inspired the cover. There's no date on the photo, so it may be a coincidence. Frazetta always claimed that he didn't use reference, although personally I think he did because a lot of his artwork looks like himself. The thing is, Caroline Munro was offered the role of Vampirella for a film.
I'm not sure if Hammer had any, because I did the two with them, had any more roles for me. There was talk about Vampirella at some stage. Actually, quite a lot. There was quite a lot of talk about that.
Maybe she was always an inspiration for the character. It's something we'll never know for sure. The biggest turning point for Frazetta's career probably came in 1964. That was the year he drew his last comic book story and the year he moved to becoming a painter full-time. And it all happened thanks to a single illustration in Mad magazine. In issue 90, Frazetta was hired to draw a caricature of Ringo from the Beatles for a fake ad on the back cover. It was seen by art directors at United Artists, and they hired Frazetta to paint a poster for their film, What's New, Pussycat? He began to get more work in Hollywood throughout that decade. One of his most famous pieces is certainly The Gauntlet for Clint Eastwood, which, by the way, Ellie negotiated selling the original art to Clint himself. Eventually, all of this work in Hollywood also led to Frazetta becoming a producer and co-creator of the animated film Fire and Ice with Ralph Bakshi. Frazetta would go on to create paintings for the rest of his career, including inventing new characters like Death Dealer. Frazetta attempted to turn Death Dealer into a comic in the mid-90s when rock star Glenn Danzig approached him and got artist Simon Beasley to draw issue 1, but that comic only went 4 issues and did not make a big impact. It's not bad art, though. On the flip side, his final story for Warren was Werewolf in the pages of Creepy issue 1 in 1964. And this, folks, is a masterful comic story. The compositions are well constructed with clear, impactful images that use a lot of eye-pleasing shapes like circles and triangles. The textures feel real And the shading pops the foregrounds and the backgrounds. There's also a great use of negative space. It is, sincerely, a fantastic comic. I wish Frank Frazetta kept doing comics, selfishly. But, as he explained to the Comics Journal, at a certain point, it just didn't make financial sense. He just was getting paid so much for his paintings that it just didn't make sense to give up that kind of time to do comics which paid less. He has a lot of love and affection for comics, it just didn't make sense. And he said he got to a point where he wanted to really think out his compositions and render detail, and the deadlines on a comic just wouldn't really allow him to do the kind of artwork that he wanted to do at that point. Because by the 1960s, Frazetta's art was masterful. Frank Frazetta talked a lot about loving shapes. In his comics interview discussion, he said, quote, "Why do we like pleasing shapes? I don't know, but we do. Buttocks? Very exciting." And I think if we look at his paintings, they frequently guide the eye around the image with circles. He uses a shadow and outlines to gently frame the subject. A lot of times, the subject itself will have a roughly triangular shape, which helps serve as a piece of visual interest that stands out against the circle. The characters can be like an exclamation point that pops in. But then, if you dig in deeper, the body parts will feature pleasant circles, and the limbs can be triangles. They work well to guide the eye without calling undue attention. Some critics have said that the poses Frazetta would construe aren't natural, and I would push back at that and say that they often are an example of something tensed up, ready to uncoil. It shows the potential burst of action. The ladies he drew have been criticized as being overly sexual, but I would say that they're seductive, but not overly explicit. And I'll tell you something I got to witness in person regarding Frank Frazetta's art. I was fortunate enough to visit Frank Frazetta's museum and meet Frank and Ellie. This was either back in 2004, 2005, I don't have it well documented, but I went with a bunch of friends. I was living in DC at the time. We were all into comics and art, and we drove up to Pennsylvania to his estate in the Poconos and visited his museum. Small, but gorgeous. You could see the originals. We got to talk to them and understand Frank's history and his approach to art. It's a lot of the stuff I'm laying out for you now with shapes. One thing stood out to me when I was looking at the artwork in person. It looks better in person, and there's a specific reason for that. So, if you are looking at an object in real life or in a painting that's in shadow, if that's a dark, thick shadow, it really should be basically black. You shouldn't be able to see detail or texture within it. And Frank did that very honestly. If he had something in shadow, it was in shadow and there wasn't a texture represented there. Except he found a way on a meta level, essentially, to add texture. Because if you look in the dark areas, there's like layered paint. And what that does is there's sort of a depth, a pitting, you might say. And it's catching light and it's catching reflected colors from that light. And it gives these dark areas the vaguest sense of real texture. Even though technically you're not seeing texture represented within the painting. It's a little hard to explain unless you see it in person. But it was like, oh wow, that's intentional. And that's just amazing. I love his compositions. Analyzing a Frazetta painting, you could honestly take hours. Or one of his later comics. The stuff for EC and the stuff for Warren, beautiful. Fortunately, a lot of it has been collected. There's a lot of specific collected editions of his EC and his creepy work. I say creepy, I really mean Warren, excuse me. And I love it. Obviously, to this day, his family still makes available the ability to see some originals at both the museum in Pennsylvania and there's a museum down in Florida. Different family members running that stuff. There are prints still made today. There are comics still made today based on his paintings. So he has an outsized impact when you consider that his time in comics was really about 19 years that he was actively making comics. But he definitely has a bigger impact, in my opinion, than that. Really gorgeous artwork. Really gorgeous. I would specifically recommend, if you want to understand some of his best work, I would recommend Werewolf from Creepy Issue 1. I think that's one of my favorites. Yeah, and then any collaboration he does with Al Williamson. Any of that stuff's gorgeous. Thank you very much for watching this episode. I hope that this takes you down a path and you're able to discover some more about Frank Frazetta, or maybe appreciate something you hadn't seen before, or learn a little bit of trivia about his work history. I always appreciate things like those likes and subscribes, and thank you once again to the sponsor of this episode, Preston Poulter and Pocket Jacks Comics with Palace of the Golden Princess. Again, details in the description below. And I'll tell you a few more things about the behind-the-scenes stuff during the credits. But until then, and until I see you next time, keep reading comics. All right, thank you so much for watching this extra little bit. So, this episode took a little longer than I expected. They often do. But I will have it out. I'm doing it while I'm on a bit of a vacation. So the next episode is also likely to take a little while to release. Sorry, I did need a break. My wife and I are on a trip. I'll try to do a little bit of vlogging, but I wanted to let you know, if you're ever like, hey, I could use just a little bit more comic book talk from you, Chris, I do a weekly show. It's a light lift for me. It's just fun. I do a weekly live stream on Monday evenings on my second channel, Comic Tropes After Dark. That also has things like indie showcases and a show that I do with artist Jim Mafood where we look at trashy movies. We've got one on Superman 4 coming up. And I think that the reaction to our Madam Web episode has been pretty strong. So I hope you'll consider checking some of that stuff out. But my live stream is always about the news of the week in comics, as well as quick reviews of the comics that have come out. I love doing that, and I love getting to chat with people live. Thank you so much for watching. I'm very excited. I'm giving some new thoughts to how to do things more efficiently in 2025 for the channel. I hope you'll stay with me. And if you'd really like to support the channel, I could always use that on Patreon. For as little as $1, you can help make sure that I can keep making this show. Thank you. See you soon.